All right, cool. Well, let's do it. I'll go ahead and kick us off. This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Are you searching for a new job? That can be stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles you don't actually want, and the job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. And sometimes you go all the way through the interview process just to find out at the very end that the salary, offer, or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Hired is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities in engineering, development, design, product management, data science, sales, and marketing. We make your job search faster, focused, and stress-free. Instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best, Hired puts you in control of when and how you connect with compelling new opportunities. After completing one simple application, top employers apply to hire you. And on Hired, you receive personal interview requests and upfront salary information so you can make informed decisions about what opportunities to pursue over a condensed timeline. Hired offers access to more than 4,000 innovative employers, including big brand names like Facebook and smaller emerging startups. The size and type of company you want to connect with is totally up to you. And we help you find new opportunities in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Open to relocation? Let them know. Your privacy and autonomy in your job search is of utmost importance. And if you go check them out at the show's link, that's hired.com/adventures in Angular, you can get double your normal hiring bonus. So instead of $300, you get $600 for signing up at our link. That's hired.com/adventures in Angular. Hey everyone, and welcome to another Adventures in Angular show. This week on our panel we have Ward Bell.
Hello everyone.
Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have two special guests. We have Jeff Whelpley.
Hello, how's it going?
And we also have Kushal Dave.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going well. So do you guys want to introduce yourselves since you haven't been on the show for a while?
So yeah, I'm the CTO of Scroll. It's a brand new startup. We've only been at it for about a year. Before that, I was at Foursquare. Before that, I was at Chartbeat. And before that, I was at Google. And way before that, I was at IBM. I've worked in a lot of monorepo code bases, so I have strong opinions about why they're awesome, although I actually haven't had the experience of working in a lot of multi-repo situations, so curious to get some other perspectives too.
All right,
cool.
You, Jeff?
Yeah, so my name is Jeff Whelpley. I'm the CTO of a small startup in Boston called GetHuman that helps people with customer service problems. I've been on Adventures in Angular a couple times before. I always like to say all the best episodes, right? I've also been on a couple other podcasts before, as well as in the open source community for a little while, author of a couple of repos on the Google Developer Expert. And I'm here today to talk about something I'm just really passionate about and something that I'm going to be talking about in some upcoming conferences.
Yeah, we have you coming to speak to us at Angular Dev Summit in September. And that's online, folks. So if you want to come and you want to watch his talk for free, just sign up. You get a ticket.
Yep, definitely. I'm really looking forward to that.
I think you've spoken at every Angular online conference I've put on.
Yeah, I think so.
So yeah, do you want to kind of give us the 10,000-foot view on this issue and just why people even think about this instead of just, I guess, doing what they always do?
Yeah, definitely. And let me even preface the problem by stating how I came to the problem, because for a long time, I think I had worked at bigger companies in the past, but I moved back to Boston 5 years ago and spent a couple years really just working by myself. Me and my other co-founder were just kind of hacking it out. And typically when you're working in like just one or two people team, you don't really have that many issues centered around dev process and coordinating changes between each other and trying to figure out the best, most optimal way to organize your code. There's some things that you deal with, but most of the time you understand the entire code base because you're working on everything. But it gets to be a much different problem once you get to have a larger team, more people that you're working with. And once we hired more people after we raised money, we had a team of 8 developers working on the same code base. And then we just started running into issues where, in essence, everything started slowing down because of different overhead related to process that was needed in order to make sure that we had quality changes, that there was no issues, and that people were able to get their changes in quickly. And really came down to something where there was like 4 major conditions that occurred where I when all 4 of these exist, then you really start feeling the pain, underlying pain of the problem that we're going to be talking about today. So the 4 things, are when you have kind of multiple code modules, where there's different code modules that have some shared code, and then multiple team members, so different team members that are trying to change that code at the same time, and a high rate of change. So if you're not changing the code base, then it's not as big of a deal. But if you every single day are pushing in changes, that's where you start to feel this pain. And the last thing is where you actually care about trying to not lose individual developer productivity, because you can certainly have your developers spend half the day with just process overhead. But if you want to set up a system where you can have all of these things and the developers are still able to produce at their all close to their rate if they were just working by themselves, you basically have to spend a lot of time and thought around your developer processes and how you actually structure your code, how you physically set up and organize your entire code base.
So I'm curious, how has everybody else done this? Like, how do you wind up organizing your code bases?
So, I can jump in here. So when I worked at Google, and I believe this is still true today, everything was in a single repository for the most part. There were 1 or 2 exceptions for client code, and I think maybe for some infrastructure things. But most of the time, all of the code was in one giant repo. And if you wanted to edit anything, all the changes went into a single place. And I think that actually worked pretty well. It allowed people to feel like they could change any of the code. It made it easy to make code base wide refactors and know if you were breaking anybody. It made it easy to keep everybody in sync about the state of the code. And I do think that there are sort of workflow and process things that you have to change in order to get that right. Probably the biggest one is trying to keep people from working in long-running branches because things start to diverge. But when we've done that, and that was the model at Foursquare too, and it's definitely the model we're using at Scroll, I think you can be really efficient. It feels pretty close to being a single developer where you can just kind of work on the code without thinking about where it lives or who owns it or if you have access or if you've checked it out or anything like that.
Yeah, that's the obvious. Well, nothing is obvious in this world. So I'm going to take that word right out of I'm going to scratch that word from my vocabulary. But those are certainly the list of benefits. But it feels like you're up against some things. Like take Google, for example, where last I looked, it's also all, well, here's Angular sitting in its own world. So there you go, its own repo. But a lot of it, you're right. A lot of Google is still in one thing. And now imagine that somebody does something. What is the CI process across all the things? I'm only working in some little tiny corner of a project, right?
Right.
But if it's all one repo, am I getting into master? And how is it even possible to run all the CI across everything before I can get my branch cleared so that it could be rolled into master? How do you manage those kinds of processes? Because at Google, I know what they do, but what do you do?
Well, so I think the answer changes at different sizes, right? So at Scroll now, and so for most of the time I was at Foursquare, it was sufficient to really just run all the builds on every commit, and again, I really believe in having people work close to master. I have sort of a long medium post about that particular workflow. But, you can land changes in master, and, if 1 of 10 builds turns green, or if you just have 1 mega build that just runs continuously, that's good enough up until 30 or 40 developers probably. And then once you hit that size, there's a variety of build tools out there that you can use to understand the structure of your code base. And once you've used one of these build tools that sort of declaratively indicates which artifacts depend on which libraries and what the full dependency tree is, you can build only the relevant CIs, right? So you can decide, hey, this change over in this corner actually only touches this binary or these tests. So let's just run those tests and see if those work. And you can get all the benefits of having a self-contained repository while still kind of incidentally finding out if somebody you didn't realize depended on your code actually is breaking as a result of your change.
One thing that I like about the approach, just having everything in master. In fact, most of the projects that I've worked on, well, I won't say most, but a number of them, we've just committed directly into master. And then
essentially what we did is we would use feature flags to turn stuff on and off. So if it was experimental, it would still go into master, and then our CI would effectively run the different builds with the different feature flags, and that way you could see if what you did broke something that somebody else was working on in process, and you could adjust for it, midstream. And so that also helped a lot. And I really like the approach of having it all pull together like that. That being said, though, I definitely see benefits for splitting things up and having specific responsibilities and smaller sections of code to be tested too. So I've seen it work both ways. I think it just depends on your approach.
Well, if you don't break it up, then, your builds get incredibly long, right? Again, it's a matter of size. So depending on the size of the organization, what I'm describing as the threat to the repo approach is more significant, and the technology you need to bring to bear to manage it becomes more significant as you have a bigger organization and more people working on what are really essentially different projects that are all thrown into a single repo. And Google obviously has this problem in spades, and they have massively parallel infrastructure under there somewhere that manages to get the build to complete in a reasonable time. As you've taken that out to smaller projects, your startups, is that less of a problem simply because of scale, or because you brought technology to the party?
I think you have to bring a little bit of technology, right? Like the in-circle CI. For now, we actually at Scroll have kind of a single mega build, but we're just now starting to look at trying to split that into a bunch of parallel builds to keep the time down, and also because you sort of conceptually want to start thinking of it as a bunch of little projects that just happen to live in the same neighborhood. And so I think we're just starting to figure it out, but build time is honestly not a big issue for us. And I would actually counter that it's much. My greater fear is a world in which people feel like they can't change all of the code. Especially at a startup, there's a tendency, I think, for people to sort of specialize in what they know best and leave the other parts as almost immutable. And I think splitting into repositories almost furthers that. And I've heard horror stories about large companies where people can't get access to certain repos and things like that. And so I worry a lot about those anti-patterns, sort of more than CI times necessarily.
Well, that's a great point. And I'll tie that into some of my experience too, because that's a great point. That is, I guess what I'm suggesting is that in order to reap that benefit, it's worth applying energy to conquering the long CI times that prevent you from merging changes. The counterforce, the counterforce that I'm getting at here is that you're trying to do some work, you're trying to accomplish something. And because of the process that's necessary, it can take very long times for your work to make it from a branch that you're ready to go with to actually arriving in master, right? Because master is the thing, and you want to get your stuff in there, and other people may be waiting for your stuff. But if all of the encumbrance of the CI process and gets in the way, then you can't iterate as fast as you'd like. In other words, that's the counterforce. How do I iterate? How do I keep the iteration speed up while achieving these other benefits that you described of making, keeping people from being siloed and making sure that everything works across the board?
Yeah. So have you worked with a setup where, the branches automatically run CI on the circle or whatever it is as people are developing? So I'd argue that as long as people are committing frequently enough, as long as people are using feature flags and constantly working in master, the probability that you're going to at any point be blocked on the CI diminishes significantly, right? Like you'll have a change that's so small. If your change is green when you start working on it, it's likely to be green when you finish working on it, I guess would be my argument. And so you're unlikely to be held up by like a constantly shifting sands that keep turning your build red just as you're about to land it.
I wish that was my experience.
Fair enough.
And that's just its size. Not only in my experience am I seeing we have to work very hard to make sure that only when we make certain changes that we're not rerunning the world, but we also have to make sure that other people who put things in don't change things we weren't expecting to change and have it go sideways. Again, this is not an argument against Monorepo. What I'm in the least, all right. All I'm suggesting is that there are friction points that come in, and maybe you've succeeded in getting them, getting at those in your world. So I just wanted to raise that one as an experience point. And I'll give you another experience point that gives me some pause, which is that when you're developing, it's great that everybody's all in one place. But when you're trying to develop something and you don't want you have to go through gatekeepers to get it in the master so you don't break everybody else, right? And when you're just reiterating on something in your own little world, you don't have to ask anybody's permission. So how do so there, in the process in which I'm experiencing the Monorepo, there's this gatekeeper process, and it protects the whole code base, but at the same time, it's in a layer of bureaucracy. And I don't know. Do you have this problem, or how do you cope with it?
We've been reviewing every piece of code before it's allowed to land in master. We've been using reviewable, which we really love, and it's been fine. It's sort of a one-trick pony, I guess. I really believe in the smallest possible change being landed on master. And so everybody on our team commits multiple times a day to master. And all of the changes, as much as possible, are really small, especially using the feature flag trick. And so in that world, yeah, there is this bureaucracy. But again, hopefully it's not holding you up too much. And I think, the flip side of that is that when your change lands, you can feel really confident that you didn't break anybody who depends on you, and that you're going to have to revisit this change, a month from now, or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's the great side of it. But you're telling me that you don't get into situations in which you have rather routinely changes across 200 files?
As a result of refactoring or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do have those. And, occasionally you will hit a conflict. But for the most part, as long as you're careful to sort of try to move really quickly on landing those as soon as you have them ready, and you sort of press people to be like, I need to land this because it's going to be annoying to constantly rebase. That has worked fine in my experience.
And actually, that's one thing that I've found over the past 9 months or so, I've tried a bunch of different configurations. We're focused on talking a little bit about Monorepo here, but I've tried from the other end of the spectrum, many small, tiny packages to kind of like groups of packages and that type of thing. And one constant is something you guys are touching on now, which is much of the pain involved with dev processes, goes away to some degree when you are really stringent about keeping your PRs really small as specific as possible, and trying to get them in quickly. So the thing that Kushal is talking about, regardless of whether you're using a Monorepo or not, that can actually benefit greatly. When you do that, there's just a lot more flexibility you can add to your tooling of like how you handle all those changes. And to be honest, I think that it almost doesn't matter. I've seen, as I've been interviewing different people with their different setups, and they all have encountered the same types of problems. As long as you are kind of trying to keep your changes, small and specific and implemented quickly, there's usually a tooling that you can apply at some level to alleviate any of the other pains that go along with, regardless of what your setup is.
Well, I think I agree. I seem to be contesting this, but I'm really not. What I'm trying to highlight is that, because then we could talk about all the problems that occur when you have separate repos, which you guys have alluded to. But you're going to have to make an investment there, is what I guess I'm getting at. It's not like magic. In other words, if you're in a world with multi-repos and you say, wow, this monorepo thing, what happens when I put everything in one place? I'm suggesting that transition has its pain points, and it does concentrate your attention for a while on, okay, how are we going to do this in a way that we don't kill, that we get the kind of productivity we want, because everybody's been operating heretofore in this world of separate silos.
I'd love to hear more actually about what tools you're using to not run the world, just to kind of compare with what we've been doing.
Well, we're using Circle CI. We have various. There also seem, and again, I don't know this deeply. I should probably preface this by saying I do a lot of work in the Angular repo. I've been working on documentation for Angular, and we had a separate repo for well over a year for Angular IO, which was the name for some reason, documentation. And in this year, we merged that into Angular, and brought the entire documentation in. And there have been tremendous benefits from that, but there has been some pain. And it has put some pressure on the processes. So, for example, if you're sitting there writing documentation, right, you're used to being able to make those changes and add that stuff right away. And because all the documentation has code involved and so forth, that should work. But we now have to fit in so that the people who can approve a change to master make sure, first of all, they had to make sure that whatever we were doing wasn't clobbering the code base, the real Angular code base. I mean, we're documentation. We're not supposed to touch the code. It's really bad if we touch the code because the whole world out there would be at risk of our touching Angular, and we're not authorized to touch Angular, right? So there's some kind of apparatus in there that detects when we're playing in our little playpen, our little directory within the repo. And as long as we stay there, it's safe and we can keep doing things and get them merged quickly. And it prevents us from and by the way, it's very easy to accidentally step out and crush something else, right? Somebody else's stuff. To tread into Angular source code itself, for example, and make a change there completely unintentionally. And so we need technology in there to detect that and say, no, your PR is stepping outside of the bounds. See what I mean? And so I don't know exactly what we have that does that. What do you have that helps people, in terms of ways of guardrails from not accidentally stepping outside of the project?
Great question. I think for us, probably the guardrails are just the reviewers. So I guess you guys have a little more of a who's watching the Watchmen situation. But I think for us, it's just that if every change getting reviewed means that to some extent there's a human check on that. I'm not sure if you can, but certainly I know that Reviewable and Fabricator both offer sort of a wide range of configuration options. And I can imagine a world in which you could sort of programmatically keep people from landing changes that didn't have that level of approval.
We do have that. I mean, somehow they've taught. I think like Google, everybody writes their own stuff, so it's hard to say what the name of something is. Because at Google, as far as I can tell, what we write ourselves is always better than what any of the rest of the world. It's just axiomatic. But I kid because I love. But there's a lot of tapping into the GitHub webhooks there somehow. And I don't know how that process is, but there are guardrails, and that actually helps the caretaker, the reviewers, right? I mean, you open one of these things up, like in documentation, we'll touch hundreds of files. It's really, asking a caretaker to watch to see that we stayed inside the colored inside the lines is tough. So I think it's reassuring. Let's put it this way. It's reassuring to have some technology that says, okay, this person is associated with these sets of boundaries. And if they want to step outside of the boundaries, they're going to have to get some other person who understands the code that's outside of the lines to join in approving that PR. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And
I just wondered if you had anything in line for that. And I think for our audience, they need to understand this, that if their organization is big, this would be something they would have to think about. Does that make sense? Or am I just...
that makes total sense. It's just a problem I haven't necessarily had to wrestle with, except at in a Google scenario where there's a bunch of tooling designed specifically for that. So does anyone else have suggestions along those lines?
Like Jeff, what are you doing?
Yeah, so for us, it's not quite the same because it sounds like you will often put in changes where you'll change like hundreds of files at the same time. And that's just hard to review. there's just challenges there that like if we saw one of our developers do that, our first reaction would be like, don't do that anymore. But it makes sense for documentation because you are probably changing, like if you changed a header, you're probably doing it across like tons of files and whatever. But okay, let's just let's get outside the documentation example for a second. And if you're doing just in the typical example, you have, let's say multiple apps, maybe multiple front end apps. Maybe if you have microservices, you might have multiple back end apps. You might have some shared code base, sections of shared code base. And the key in my mind is to really be careful about what you're doing. Is this a change where you are just bumping version numbers, for example, which is actually a pretty frequent thing that happens for us? Like you're okay, all that's happening is we're moving to the latest version of Mongoose or whatever. Or is this something where you're actually changing business logic? And don't try to mix the two. And that gets hard at times. Like it takes a lot of discipline to not mix those together. And then you run into other issues. And this is where we can maybe talk about, besides kind of refactoring, some of the other issues and challenges that occur with multiple repos, like versioning. So when you do have things separated out and you're relying on versions between different items, one of the big issues is when you change a downstream dependency, you basically have to make a choice. Are you going to force at the same time all the upstream dependencies to change like in that moment? Or are you going to allow the downstream dependency to get pushed in and released, and then the upstream dependencies just have to upgrade whenever they get the opportunity? Either one of those requires some effort. If you just push it in and don't change all the upstream dependencies, then you essentially have to manage multiple versions potentially of the same downstream dependency. And if you force everybody else upstream to update, then there's just like this overhead, especially with multiple repos, that occurs with bubbling up that change. And then it somewhat gets alleviated with monorepos because you obviously have access to everything at once. But we definitely, before we had certain tooling in place, that was definitely very painful for you when you have like a lot of smaller repos. Does that make sense?
It's painful when you have a lot of smaller repos because they can all go their own ways. It's also painful for the monorepo. Like if you say, all right, everybody, we're going to Webpack 3. I mean, like everybody's on board all at once, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or you don't, it's this new version of TypeScript. I hope everybody's all ready because here we go. And like other people have their priorities and they got to stop. Or have you guys finessed that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think I've seen, and Kushal, you can let me know what you do, but I think I've seen when I've read from different big monorepo implementations that a lot of them end up like that. Yeah, you kind of all have to move in sync for some of that stuff. But do you, Kushal, do you have a way of allowing different people to upgrade some of those dependencies at different times?
Yeah, that is definitely the hard one. Like, the only way I've ever seen it done is a really brutal, all-nighter by somebody who has to sit there and get everything working, which is awful. And hopefully, the number of those things is infrequent enough that it's just you kind of deal with the consequences. Obviously, the upside is that that.
Yeah, it happens daily for us.
Yeah.
It's like, there's a new version of, and not only that, but we have different things in different flights, right? So we've got the current product, and then you got the new, where you're going, and then there's the one you got to maintain, and the one you got to maintain is pinned at one thing, and the one place where you're going to go is going to use the new stuff, which can be external dependencies and internal breaking changes, and it's like, wow, how do I manage this? This is hard anyway.
Yeah, I think.
But now you make it hard for everybody.
The Golang guys wrote something really interesting, like maybe I don't know. I just saw it a week ago. I don't know when it came out, but about how one of the things that Google does is they've developed a lot of patterns around how to refactor code and why they need type defs in order to make that easier. So I think there's some code level things you can do to try to insulate yourself if you're making some really insane internal refactor. But yeah, some of those bigger deps you just kind of have to rip off the Band-Aid, and it's hard. There's no question.
Now, one solution that I've seen that actually is kind of cool and interesting that is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from Monorepo is, our friend, which I think most of you guys on the show know, Dr. Gleb Balmatov, who's been a frequent Angular speaker and podcast speaker and everything. So he is a huge fan of open source, smaller repos. A lot of the mentality of keeping things small and separate and distinct. And what he's done is, like, he recognizes a lot of the problems that we're talking about today, but he's decided that he's going to stick in the kind of many repo universe and just create tooling to solve like some of these things. And so for versioning, even though, like I was saying, it was very painful for me, and I was talking to him about this, he actually has, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'll include a link in the show notes for this. He has like a series of little tools that he's created to like deal with this. And so for the versioning thing, for example, what he does is he runs this server that just basically is in charge for all of his open source projects. All it does is whenever it detects that a new version has been published, it will automatically try to update it and run all the tests. And if it passes, then it just checks in the update and then publishes it for that upstream dependency. Now, that only works if you actually have really good tests, which, I mean, that's a whole other subject. But assuming that you do, it actually can be kind of elegant, because then you could just change that downstream dependency and you don't have to like worry about like bubbling it up. Like that sort of happens in the background. So I thought that was kind of an interesting solution to at least part of this problem.
Yeah, another interesting thing that brings up is sort of the issue of, yeah, it's great that if you have different repos, you can move differently in terms of dependencies. But if you're now out of sync, you may suddenly have incompatible sort of transitive dependencies across all of what you're doing. And that is a much worse situation to be in. I would argue it's very hard to get out of.
That's a certainty. That's a dead certainty.
Yep.
So so it's a question of when you want to deal with the problem. In a monorepo repo, you just face into it, and everybody's got to face into it at the same time. With a multi-repo, you can put off that horrible moment and possibly get yourself into a deep hole because you're not forced to cope with it until perhaps when it's much more painful. But it does, in the short term, free you from somebody else's crusade to move to Webpack 3. You know what I mean?
One thing that I also want to add in here, when we're talking about get out of sync, there are actually two ways you can get out of sync. And you're talking about dependencies where, yeah, I'm pulling in Webpack 3, everything else is set up for Webpack 2, bad, pain, bad, because it's all in the same repo. The other way that, with the multi-repo that you can get out of sync, though, is not just in the dependencies in the build process, but the APIs. So if you have a module that you're working on over here, and hey, we're going to move to this cleaner API, well, whatever's consuming it on the other side, as a driver, well, we didn't get around to updating that yet. And so when you go to build it, it doesn't talk properly. And so you can get out of sync that way too with multiple repos. And so you have to make sure that you're communicating in both of those instances. Don't wait for users to report problems. Raygun gives you complete visibility on errors, crashes, and performance problems affecting your end users. You can replicate issues in seconds rather than digging through log files and having to rely on users to report errors or crashes. Raygun gives you a window into how users are really experiencing your software applications. It has full support for JavaScript and all other major languages and platforms. It takes less than 10 minutes to set up, and you can get a free 14-day trial by going to raygun.com and signing up today.
Definitely.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of one other thing. In addition to the getting out of sync with the backend API, one like big issue that we ran into, which actually forced us to realize that we couldn't or we didn't want to keep things out of sync, and now we have a process where we keep everything in sync at the same time, is because specifically of Angular DI. So, like in our front end, we have multiple apps. We have a native script app, and we have multiple web apps, and we have some shared libraries, some shared component libraries, some other libraries that have ng modules that are pulled in by those different Angular apps. And one thing that ran into is that with DI, if you aren't actually using the same version, you run into DI issues because it's not actually like with DI, it has to be the exact same thing at every level, or else the injection token is different. So that was like before we realized what was going on. That was like a couple days of like super annoying. Like why is this not working? Before I think we actually even had to debug into like Angular core to like see that like one token was different than the other, and we're like, oh, okay. So now for that reason, we are very stringent about keeping all versions in sync.
That makes sense.
It does. So, by the way, I'm going to reiterate at several points that I like the Monorepo. So we're going to circle back to that. I'm not going to let the show go without my giving a thumbs up to it. But I just I want to make some other observations about what you're facing. By asking, well, first of all, I'll give an observation, then I'll ask the question. So what I've noticed is that members of the Angular team often they explore new things in their own private repos. All right, even if it's let's assume it's an authorized project, which it usually is. But they may want to say, hey, I'm developing a new HTTP way to do the HTTP module. We're going to have a complete successor to that. Well, the first place I see that happens is usually in somebody's one of the developer's own private repos, not in the primary repo. And only later do they bring it in. My other example of that is we had a debate about we were going to build a new doc viewer for Angular docs. There was a force that wanted to create that as a separate repo and iterate over it and bring it in later versus develop it from scratch inside the Monorepo. So what do you guys do if you're about to venture into a new something or other? Do you develop that new something within the Monorepo, or do you first kick it around to iterate quickly in some other repo and then promise to bring it in?
I can tell you that it depends to some degree. If there are a lot of dependencies or shortcuts I can take by relying on the Monorepo, I will do it in the Monorepo. So, for example, if there's something else in there that I can take advantage of, or it auto loads the correct libraries for me automatically, and I don't have to do a whole lot of setup, and it saves me that effort, a lot of times it'll go in the Monorepo. But if it's small and independent and it's going to move quickly, then a separate repo may be the right answer.
Yeah, I think if it's something that you're likely to actually want to land, there are a lot of benefits to doing it in the Monorepo, especially if you can control it with feature flags. You have the benefit of sort of reviewing as you go instead of trying to review a giant PR, that is going to make your eyes glaze over. And it also allows you to sort of keep up with, and for others to keep up with you in terms of breaking API changes rather than having some sort of brutal merge, or you being surprised by somebody or you surprising somebody else. I think if it's truly, truly speculative, obviously it's fair to be often in a branch or your own copy of the repo or whatever.
Jeff,
yeah, I mean, I usually do it as a separate repo. Just I guess sort of along the lines of some of the reasoning that you're mentioning, Ward, for the Angular team. Like, I mean, for us, I guess it is a difference, like Chuck was saying, of is this like kind of an experimental thing, or is this just like a new feature? Because if it is, we all the time, like almost every week, we're creating new like separate small repos just for like experimental stuff that we're trying out, and a lot of that is because, and this is even if we are using reuse, even if we have to copy over some code from the main repo just to get it working, we found that like it disturbs people less. Like there's a whole thing. I mean, I know that there's ways to like kind of quiet the updates so that you only get kind of notified of changes in certain parts of a repo. But I think there's a lot of people on our team who do want to just see like in the main repo, like see everything that occurs, because we're still a relatively small team. So they appreciate when something is just like experimental and it may not even land, like it may just be totally throwaway. Just do it somewhere else and then kind of bring it over once it's a little bit fully baked, just for if nothing else, for the sake of alleviating some of the notifications that go on with everybody else.
Yeah, that's a good point. The whole notification thing is definitely not a solved problem, especially with GitHub, which seems to have not spent a lot of time trying to make that powerful. We've built a lot of sort of custom Slack hooks in order to try to get notifications tailored to the parts that you care about.
Yeah, good point. So my observation, Jeff and you guys, is that from what I hear, it is when you have a very small team, it can make like one person or two people. Then the separate repo can often be the great place to experiment with it. We had a debate when we started the Angular documentation new doc viewer thing. We ended up deciding, which is to say Igor decided, that it would be done in a monorepo. And that was painful at the beginning, but ended up, I think, being a good decision. It was painful at the beginning because of all the things that you said. Why was it a good decision, or why was it painful in the beginning?
Both.
It was painful in the beginning because we were slowed down by having to figure out how to fit it in to everybody else's process, because it was going to be in master, right? And how do we make sure that we're developing in such a way that we don't just have to wait for everybody else to have the approval process, or how do we keep its because it was really almost a thing unto itself. How do we keep from triggering all the other CI processes and just focus on the ones that matter? It was those things have to be worked out as you develop a new project. But there were enough of us, and there were enough, and the reason it turned out to be a good idea was that there were enough of us who were involved that we were going to pretty soon have to have all that process that you actually have in a monorepo to make people work together well, right? That's one of the things you share that we didn't mention. When you have a mono, maybe we did mention, and we didn't. I'm just bringing attention back to it because it may actually have been one of your original benefits of a monorepo, which is that you get consistency of process across the whole thing. And we got that. Consistency of tooling, consistency of everything that you eventually are really going to want. It's right there. That's a real plus. The other thing was that we were able to share our results and get other people involved when it was part of the monorepo, which is harder to do. People outside, our initial scope was just us developing the thing. But we could seamlessly decide when it was time, or as it was time, to bring in the rest of the Angular team and the rest of the Angular community to look at our work and to participate in it, because it was in a monorepo, which would have been much harder if it had been a separate repo. And then the third benefit is that the work that we're doing in our project actually intersects Angular itself and is intended to be a series of tests against Angular itself. In other words, that whether the doc viewer works or not, and whether the tests on our samples work or not, is one of the ways we know whether Angular itself works or not. And so the benefit of getting that into the larger monorepo as early as possible was right there. We were getting the feedback on the larger product of Angular itself quicker by developing our documentation viewer and all that other stuff inside the monorepo. And I suspect that, I think that goes back to the original value points that you guys were pointing out, which is when everybody's in the same playpen, you find out real fast whether something that you're doing, where all the points intersect, whether something you're doing over in that corner of the room affects somebody in the other room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's actually, leading into a point that I kind of wanted to bring up with monorepos. So pretty early in my career, we worked on a monorepo. This was in Rails, but, I think it's applicable here. And we wound up writing this huge, what was termed a monorail at the time, which is a huge, monolithic application. And the problem we ran into was that everything was tightly coupled. And so everything anybody did affected everybody else. And, you're talking about kind of the virtues of that ward where it's, we make a change and then we can see if it works with everything else. And I think that's highly valuable. But if things are highly coupled and it makes it hard for you to change the repo, and it's easy to fall into that trap with a monorepo, how do you deal with that? I mean, of course, our next iteration of that application, we went totally over to service-oriented architecture and had exactly the the reverse of the problem. So I've seen it both ways. So, but yeah, I mean, how do you work it out so that things aren't so tightly coupled that you making a change to the code in the repo, affects the guy sitting next to you working on something that really isn't too tightly related to it?
I think the most important thing that I've brought everywhere with me is the organization of your code into a DAG. I guess I've been doing it so long, I almost take it for granted, but I realize that a lot of people haven't had that experience.
Directed acyclic graph is what you mean by a DAG?
Exactly. So that there are no circular dependencies between your packages, even transitively. And if you can add something to your CI that enforces that, and in the as a monorepo grows, you may eventually have tooling that requires that for your build system. By having that requirement, it forces your code to be clean. It really makes you think about, is this layer supposed to even know this layer exists? Can this layer have this type of functionality, or does it need to be moved into a new package? And having to think about that, I think, is like almost is totally necessary to have a monorepo. Otherwise, you will definitely end up with a mess.
A plus 100 for that. I think you're right. You have to do that in order to survive in a monorepo, and it means that it improves your architecture.
So how exactly do you do this? Because I'm not sure I completely visualize what this looks like.
So I can give you the exact example of what we're doing. So we're working in Java, and we have sort of a classic thing where there's a user and there's an organization, and then there's like an object that a user creates that points back to a user and organization. And so we have a Java check that makes sure that the DAG is enforced, and then as like a soft rule, we've said, this object that users and organizations create can know about users and organizations can know about users, but users can never depend back into organizations or back into these objects. So you can draw out a tree of what knows about what. And then we also have the same thing at sort of at a vertical slicing thing. So you can think about sort of the layered model of networking, right? So we have the pure data model objects are not allowed to know anything about the service layer that interacts with the database. The database can know about those model objects, but shouldn't know anything about the web tier. The web tier can obviously know about both the model objects and the service tier because it utilizes both of those. And so you kind of build up these sort of intersecting layer cakes of things that are allowed to know about one another.
Gotcha.
Is that defined within like config files? Like, what is the actual relationships? Like, how are those defined?
So I think the ideal is that this is defined in sort of build files. And so if you look at Pants or Blaze or Buck, all those build systems have explicit dependency configurations so that you can sort of keep any of those invariants from being broken on like kind of a pairwise basis. For us, we're not quite there yet. So we just have like a wiki page that lists out the rules. And then we have a test that just looks for any cycles in any package dependencies. In the Java world, there's a pretty easy way to kind of add it to your to just like a JUnit test. And so if you do that, then that's kind of your backstop against somebody screwing up and nobody catching it in code review.
Mm. Yeah, it's cool. One thing that we did create, which probably should open source at some point because it's not proprietary at all per se, is basically a little CLI tool that walks down all subdirectories from wherever you're running it, finds like all of your package. So like we do all JavaScript, so both front end and back end. So there's everything has like a package JSON. So finds all the package JSONs like in all your subdirectories, and then kind of like creates the dependency graph like for those. But then also sees where the Git repos are. So like for us, we haven't fully moved to one monorepo, but we did start to consolidate. So we have a couple kind of larger repos. And so like the larger repos have like a bunch of like NPM modules within it. And so this tool will see the dependency graph for all the NPM modules and then also see the dependencies between the repos based off of the NPM module dependencies. So yeah, we use that for build stuff and actually a variety of other things for doing kind of like bulk changes among the different modules and repos.
That reminds me, I guess we should reassure people that just because you have one role, you can have multiple you can be reproducing multiple NPM packages out of a single monorepo. Angular itself is that way.
Mhm.
All of Angular is in there, but you go at Angular/core, at Angular/common. Each of those is its own NPM package, even though all the source code is one place. I that may seem an obvious point, but it wasn't obvious to me, and I couldn't tell you how to do it exactly, but I know that we do it.
So are there other
magic,
trade-offs?
huh?
One other thing that I'm wondering about here is I see people, we're kind of talking like multi-repo or monorepo, and, is it one or the other, or can you have like a couple of, like a multi-mono repo where you have several large ones instead of, I don't know how exactly to explain it, but, where you're not breaking it up so far that there's a ton of stuff to keep track of in a bunch of different places. And at the same time, you're not having some of the issues that come up with doing everything in the same place.
Yeah, so one thing that we're trying out now, and it's not perfect, is to have one, like, quote unquote, like, I guess I shouldn't call it a monorepo, one larger repo that basically has all of our non-deployable code. So, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff we have for just different libraries of different sorts, stuff that isn't an app by itself or isn't an API endpoint or whatever. And then we have a separate set of repos, just a handful of them for the actual deployable code. And this is really because we just haven't made the jump where Kushal is kind of advocating for using some of these build tools, like there's Bazel too, which I don't think we mentioned yet, from Google, which is a version of their kind of internal tool, build tool that they use. And you can use these things, and I am eventually going to try those out. But for now, at least, it is easier, like from a building tool perspective, to have like one quote unquote deployable per repo. So we'll have like one just app for a given repo, and then the bigger thing that has all the shared code in another thing. And that's at least alleviating some of the pain. It's definitely not perfect. But there is, to your point, Chuck, there is a middle ground for sure of different options that I've seen.
Yeah, another thing that I haven't seen a really great solution for is when you want to open source a portion of what you're doing, but not obviously your entire company's code base. And so in that scenario, I think there's really no way out of having a separate repo for that. And then I've seen places where the code is just copied from one to the other. Or you could do the actual work of trying to factor out sort of the common code and then factor out the thing you're really trying to open source.
Yeah, Kushal, actually, I'm glad you brought that up because I had forgotten about that. That was like one of the biggest points that Gleb made up when he was kind of like touting the smaller repo. That it's almost like when you think about that part of things, it's almost like a cultural thing too. It's like, do you want to encourage your team and what you're building to be open sourced or not? I mean, it's not saying that you can't do that when you have a monorepo. There's different ways to do it. Angular, obviously, Google obviously does it with different ways. But the people that are on the side, like the Gleb side of the fence, who are very much into like, no, we're doing everything in kind of these smaller repos. It is much more of a culture of like, no, like why wouldn't you open source things? Like it's all, like almost like an open source first mentality. So there's like a cultural element there as well.
To clarify, I think at Google, there's this giant internal repo because not everything they have is open source, and Angular is open source. So that's at least one driver, if not, I don't know if it's the only driver, but it's one driver for why Angular is in a public GitHub repo because it's a public project, and Google has its own, and then they have an ongoing reconciliation process because Google uses so much of Angular. But that's why we couldn't have one. That's at least one reason why there isn't one giant Google repo and Angular is inside it, because it's not all of Google is not open source, from what I can see.
Yeah, and I think it is cultural too, because some companies, they want sort of the open collaboration and free support, I guess, from the community and upgrades from the community, and then other companies see that they're giving away some kind of competitive advantage that they're not willing to give up. And I don't know that either of them is wrong. It just depends on the way you look at things.
Yeah, definitely.
And you can look at things both ways. I mean, there's every reason to believe that you have your own stuff and then the stuff you want to make public. And it isn't necessary that a company should decide to be all one or the other.
Yep.
Well, no, I think that's true, but it's something to be said for like which of those is a first-class citizen within your organization. So it's not that you're preventing it per se, but there is a slight cultural difference in which you see as kind of like the top of mind.
Yeah, that's true. So let's take up as we're about to. It sounds like we're ready to close it, but are we all? So where does everybody stand? I'm raising my hand, saying that the needle points to monorepo, and I would not have said that last year. But I'm feeling that despite my throwing darts at it and all that, my net experience is that I've ended up liking the monorepo, and I would say that the audience ought to give it serious consideration.
I would like to ask a qualifying question on this discussion. And that is, do you feel like, for you, Ward, who's saying you're in favor of it, and I don't know that I've explicitly heard it, but I assume that our guests are also saying the same thing. Do you feel like it's true that monorepo is better in all cases?
Well, Joe, first of all, I wouldn't don't make the assumption that I am agree. Kushal definitely he's all in.
He's all in.
Yeah. But on my side, I see the benefits, and I recognize that there's a number of organizations that have successfully implemented it, but I don't see it as like a perfect solution per se. And actually, the other thing that bothers me is that I don't feel like there is something where like, okay, I'm a new organization and I'm going to do monorepo. How am I going to do that? It seems as though, well, there are a lot of organizations that do it. There isn't an easy way for someone to just like, it's not like common knowledge, and there's not like a well-known set of tooling and best practices of like, this is how you do it. Kushal has a lot of experience and has seen, I'm sure you told me before, Kushal, some of like the bad implementations and some like issues that people have had. And I think in your current environment, you've kind of like pulled the best of all worlds. What I would like to see, and sort of one of the reasons why I'm like really interested in this topic, and speaking here, speaking at the upcoming conference and everything, is to like bring forth kind of like this problem that I really believe that most of us deal with. Most of us are working in environments where we run into this issue one way or another in whatever our current repo and code setup is. And so trying to like rally everybody behind understanding what the problem is, and then converging on a better set of practices and conventions and tools and stuff like that. And I think that at some point, there is stuff out there for sure, but I think that there still is a lot to go to get to the point where it's like a no-brainer, where like this isn't even a discussion. It's just like, okay, everybody knows how to do this the right way. And I think when we get there, I still don't think it'll be one specific solution, because there's the cultural thing. There's a couple other things with specifically how your environment is set up and like what works best for you. But I do think that we can get to the point where once you decide culturally and because of what you're trying to build, like what is going to work best for you, that it's very clear how to kind of implement that in the best way. Whereas right now, I don't think that's the case.
I think my answer would be, for my own personal stuff, I don't know how to do a monorepo, so I can't. So therefore, I wouldn't have one. But if I was an organization starting an organization, I would go figure out how to do it, and I would want my organization to have a monorepo.
I would have to say, it's funny because, Ward said if you'd asked me last year, I wouldn't have said monorepo. And that's generally where I wind up, is whichever one seems to solve the problems that I've most recently had to deal with. So I probably go back and forth over the years. But I would say that I tend to lean toward monorepo, but I don't always do it either. So I think I really just kind of wind up where I wind up. And the other caveat that I would put in there is, even if I start with a monorepo, that doesn't mean that's where I'm going to end. And I think a lot of times people get kind of wound up on, well, what if I make the wrong decision? And the answer is if you put them all in separate repos and it turns out, you know what, we kind of need the benefits of having this all in the same place, you can do that. You can move them all into one repo. And the same with having a monorepo. It may not be easy, It may be kind of a thorny problem depending on how big and complicated you make your mono, or the way you tie together your disparate repos, but you can switch. So if you're finding that one isn't working for you, you can start moving toward the other setup. But yeah, I tend to lean toward Monorepo, but I'm not just going to say, hey, you know what? I'm always going to do it that way.
Yeah, and I'm all in. I think the only times I wouldn't do it are if I truly were building a bunch of disparate open source projects and I really wanted them to play in the open source ecosystem, and that was my priority. But I think my number one goal in sort of all the decisions I make as sort of an engineering manager or CTO is always, how can my team move as quickly as possible? And I really think the Monorepo, more than anything, is optimized for speed, right? Everyone's constantly up to date with the latest code, and sometimes that sucks, but like the net benefit is that everyone's kind of moving together rapidly as you start to change how you do things. I do wish the tooling were better. I really hope that as more people move to this model, that the tooling will catch up, and Circle CI will support this as a first-class citizen, and Reviewable will support this as a first-class citizen, and GitHub will. Because there still is this notion of multiple deployables that just the tools don't totally appreciate today, that it would be nice if they did.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Joe?
I would be open to it in a large organization.
Open to what?
With some experience, Monorepo.
You sound very happy about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that implies, I think I see the benefits, but I'm not sure that I'm personally convinced the benefits in a small environment with few devs, not a lot of experience. I think that the separate repos, it's one of those, keeps things a little bit simpler for not thinking about it. But I'm not like radically convinced, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But on the other hand, I can see that this could solve a lot of problems.
But it's basically, Joe was saying, it's a dumpster fire.
We're back to that, are we?
It's one piece of the dumpster fire.
All righty. Well, are there good places for people to go to kind of evaluate where they're at and decide which way they want to go before we wrap up and go to picks? I mean, we've covered a lot of the trade-offs, but I'm wondering if there are like a set of guidelines online or...
Well, so this is part of the reason why I'm interested in giving this talk, is because there's a bunch of articles for sure. I'm going to include some of those articles in the show notes for stuff like on both either side, like people who are pro Monorepo, who kind of advocating for that, and pro Multirepo, like people who got burned from it, and a couple of really interesting articles for that. But I have yet to find one that sets forth like a good mental model, like decision framework almost, for like, okay, if you are like this and this and this, then you should use this. I haven't seen that before, and that's sort of what I hope to create in the next couple weeks before this conference.
Gotcha. All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks. This episode is sponsored by Angular Dev Summit, coming September 11th through the 18th, 2017. Hi, it's Chuck from devchat.tv. I reached out to some of my friends in the Angular community to put on a completely free, no-travel conference for Ruby developers. We have speakers like Rob Wermald, Jeff Whelpley, and others coming to speak about all kinds of topics in Angular. So if you're trying to learn Angular or you're trying to level up Angular, come check it out. The talks are happening throughout the day each day, and we'll have a chat available during each session. Attending the talks is free, but you need to register. Go to angulardevsummit.com. Ward, do you have some picks for us?
Sure. I just got back from hiking the Sierras. I never give technology picks. And I took out fly fishing for the first time in my life, and I caught my first fish ever. And it's catch and release, by the way. So no fish were truly harmed in my experiment. I had a great time, and there was I'm putting in a link to a particular place in the Southern Sierras, which is gorgeous, and you should go there. And whether you catch a fish or just hike to it, it's just wow. So that's in the Southern Sierras near Mammoth. So I just put a link into it.
Nice. All right, I'm going to jump in here with some picks then. So I don't it's funny because from week to week, and the fact that I record 3+ shows every week, I can never remember if I picked something last week. So if I repeat picks, I'm real sorry. So I've been going through a couple of things that I've been looking at, and one of them is just managing money, both personally and across the podcast and things. And I ran across a book called Profit First, and they talk about how to allocate your money depending on how much is coming in, and putting certain amounts of it away for a rainy day or for profit or for paying the owner of the business and things like that. And it's kind of helped me get my head around where things are at, and okay, so I should be setting aside this much more than I'm setting aside for things like taxes and stuff. And so it's been a really helpful book if you're looking at running your own business or doing things in a particular way. It just kind of sets up a system so that it's automatic and everything goes where it's supposed to. So that's Profit First, and the author is Mike and he has like a weird German last name that's hard to pronounce. So anyway, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And then the other thing is Lucas mentioned last week the ketogenic diet, and I've been jumping on that. And anyway, so just to put things out there, if you're diabetic, the way that they measure how sick you are, or one of the ways that they measure it, is by testing your hemoglobin. And there's anyway, the measurement's the A1C, and basically they're measuring how much sugar is on your red blood cells. And the higher the number, obviously, the sicker you are. They want it to be below 7 if you're diabetic, or 7.5. I've heard both numbers. And historically, mine has been about a 10. And so it's been really high. 10 is really high. When I was diagnosed, it was 15, which they were looking at me like, okay, you're going to pass out and go into a coma any minute. So anyway, I went to my doctor this morning, and my number was 7.3. So it's really been helping me both feel better, and it's helped me get my diabetes under control. So I'm going to kind of double down on Lucas's pick last week of the ketogenic diet. And finally, the last thing that I'm going to pick is something we all take for granted, and which I got fixed today upstairs in my house, and that's the air conditioning. Air conditioning makes life very nice. So I'm going to pick air conditioning.
Sweet.
Joe, do you have some picks for us?
Okay, so I want to pick two things. One is a book I've been reading called Everybody Lies. The subtitle is Big Data, New Data, and What the Internet Can Tell Us About Who We Really Are. I found this to be extremely fascinating, right? It's this book about how when social scientists are trying to figure out how people behave, they take surveys, use surveys typically, and we lie so effectively to not only other people, but even to ourselves, that surveys are very skewed about what people actually do and how they behave.
That's a lie, Joe.
For a lot of different reasons. And so his book is a lot about combing the Google search phrases and basically Google Trends to find things out. And he talks a lot about racism in the U.S. and sex in the U.S. and stuff like that. And it's been pretty interesting. In fact, what was really funny was at the very beginning of the book, he talks about how when Google started publishing Google Trends, one of the things they said in the announcement was, this is not the type of data that anybody should be writing a PhD thesis on. And he was looking for a PhD thesis, and he immediately decided that was what he's going to do, is write his PhD thesis on Google Trends data. But it's a fascinating book about a look into humanity and ourselves and I just thought it was just great. So I highly recommend it. Everybody Lies. And the other thing I want to pick is, if you happen to travel to Rome, sometime during the spring, summer, fall, I highly recommend that you rent a scooter to ride around Rome. It's a crazy, wild experience. You end up in oncoming traffic in the opposite lane, driving in oncoming traffic, cars coming at you, and
like
you learn
razor? Like a razor or something? What are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, Vespa is kind of the typical.
What could be more fun than head-on traffic, Joe?
And you watch what the other scooter riders do, and you see, and all of a sudden this sort of, here in the US, our traffic laws are so well defined, right? There's no vagueness to them at all. And in some places like Rome, there's a lot more vagueness to how traffic actually flows. And you learn to see a beauty and order come out of this chaos that's just this sort of shared mutual understanding about how we really should drive, regardless of what lines may tell us. And,
Joe, I lived in Italy for 2 years, and I can tell you that their traffic suggestions are just as clear as our traffic laws are here.
So anyway, I had a great time. I thought it was super, super fun, and I never really at any point felt actually in danger. You drive into oncoming traffic, and the oncoming traffic knows to move over for you. They're looking for you, and they move out of the way, and you create this third lane. And it also just makes getting around Rome so much easier. Rome has tons of traffic, but if you have a scooter, it's like there's zero traffic. You can get from point A to point B inside of Rome in, just a few minutes, never worrying about traffic, and it's easy to find a place to park. So I highly recommend, not only just for the ease of getting around, but also the experience of it. Rent a scooter if you happen to go to Rome. Those are my picks.
I have to say that I've also seen grandmas load an incredible amount of groceries on a Vespa.
I'm sure.
Anyway, Jeff, what are your picks?
So I just really have one pick. I created a survey actually for this topic, and results are not all tabulated yet, but for the conference talk, I will have that as one of the things we will discuss. So I will put the link out there, and it's basically just asking you questions about what you do in your environment. We talked a lot today about what all of us do and some of the advantages and disadvantages, what we don't like and don't like. So I want to hear from everybody who's listening to this show as well. So I'll include it in the notes, but it's whlp.ly/survey-repo.
All right, Kushal, what are your picks?
I have one technical one and one non-technical one. The technical one, one of the people here at Scroll passed along an article from sort of a technical leader at the Hillary campaign that he wrote while he was there, I think, about doing design reviews. I'm pretty familiar with the process where you write a design doc and you share it out and people just come on it. And I'm also pretty familiar with the process where people have a meeting where everyone gets together, the architecture is presented, and people try to come up with feedback on the fly. And neither of those feels super optimal. And I'm really excited to try this process. I have not yet tried it. That's kind of a fusion of the two, where you kind of produce a document and do a little bit of pre-work, but then actually meet in real life to talk through whether that architecture actually makes sense or not. So really, really intrigued about that. I'm always interested in processes for design review. And then the non-technical pick is this book that's pretty old, but I was about to get on a plane, which turned out to be 5 hours delayed. And fortuitously, my boss recommended this great book called The Orphan Master's Son. And it's very appropriate for our current times because it's about a man who lives in North Korea and all of his crazy adventures. And it's a really great page turner and totally fascinating, and I highly recommend it.
All right. Well, if people want to connect with you or follow you or, see you on Twitter, etc., where do they go, Kushal?
I'm at Crave with a K, Krave. And I'm also going to make a small plug we can put in the show notes. I wrote a Medium post about the workflow we use in terms of trying to keep people on master and make that as easy as possible. And I'd recommend that anyone trying to do that, take a look at that.
All right. And Jeff, how do people find you, follow you, read your blog, etc.?
Yeah, you can follow me at Jeff Whelpley on Twitter. And actually, I'm going to be publishing a blog post in the next week or so on this topic as well. So you can follow me on Medium at Jeff Whelpley as well.
I hope we have that link in the show notes. And Kushal, if you'll come back with any of your links to this stuff, because I think this is an important decision for organizations.
Yep. Jeff, Angular Air is still a thing too, right? People want to go listen to you talk every week?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm not hosting anymore. Justin Schwarzenberger took over for me and doing a great job. But I do show up from time to time. I'm actually going to be on next week.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. Thank you both for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
Yep, we'll catch everyone next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.